My mother convinced my fiancé to marry my cousin, saying, "He'll give you the life my son never could." I disappeared without a word. Years later, we met again at a lavish gala I hosted, and when they saw who my wife was, their smiles vanished. I, 32M, sat in my apartment that October evening, scrolling through wedding venue options on my laptop, when my phone buzzed with a message from my fiancé asking if we could meet urgently. She wanted to talk about something important, she said, and her tone felt off. I told her I'd be there in 20 minutes. The coffee shop was nearly empty when I arrived. She sat in the corner booth, her hands wrapped around a cup she hadn't touched. I slid into the seat across from her and immediately knew something was wrong. Her eyes were red, and she couldn't look at me directly. I asked her what happened, my stomach already tightening with dread. She took a shaky breath and told me we needed to end our engagement. The words hit me like a physical blow. I sat there, frozen, trying to process what I'd just heard. When I finally managed to ask why, she looked away and said she'd been thinking about our future, about the kind of life we could build together, and she didn't think it was enough. I reminded her that I'd just been promoted to senior analyst at my firm, that we'd been saving for our future, that we had plans. She cut me off and said my cousin had proposed to her that morning. My cousin, the golden boy of our family, the one who'd inherited his father's real estate business at 25, the one who drove luxury cars and wore custom suits. She said he could give her the life she deserved, the life I never could. I felt like the ground had disappeared beneath me. I asked her if she was serious, if she was really doing this. She finally met my eyes and told me my mother had spoken to her several times over the past month. My mother had apparently laid out in detail how my cousin was the better choice, how I was too focused on my modest career, how she didn't want to see her future daughter-in-law struggle the way she had struggled with my father. The betrayal was complete. My own mother had orchestrated this, had convinced the woman I loved that I wasn't good enough, had pushed her into my cousin's arms. I stood up without another word, walked out of that coffee shop, and never looked back. That night, I called my supervisor and requested an immediate transfer to our Singapore office. The firm had been trying to fill a position there for months, and I told them I'd take it. Within 2 weeks, I'd sold everything I owned, packed 2 suitcases, and disappeared. I didn't attend their wedding. I didn't respond to my mother's calls or my father's concerned messages. I simply vanished from their lives as completely as they'd vanished from mine. Singapore became my reset button. I threw myself into work with a ferocity that surprised even me. The pain of betrayal became fuel. Every deal I closed, every client I secured, every promotion I earned was another step away from the man they deemed insufficient. My supervisor in Singapore recognized my drive and mentored me, introducing me to the right people, teaching me not just the technical aspects of finance, but the art of building relationships in high-stakes environments. Within a year, I'd made senior portfolio manager. Within 2, I'd been headhunted by a prestigious investment firm that wanted to expand their Asian operations. I took the offer and the generous signing bonus and invested every spare dollar I had into learning everything I could about emerging markets and alternative investments. That's when I met her, my current wife. She was a successful architect who'd been invited to present at a finance and development conference I was attending. She was brilliant, accomplished, and came from a family of entrepreneurs who'd built their wealth through innovation and risk-taking. When she presented her firm's sustainable development projects, I was captivated not just by her ideas, but by the quiet confidence she exuded. We started talking after the panel, and that conversation stretched into dinner, which stretched into months of getting to know each other. She knew about my past. I'd learned not to hide my scars, and she never judged me for it. If anything, she understood. Her own family had faced their share of betrayals in business, and she valued loyalty and integrity above everything else. We married quietly in a small ceremony in Bali, surrounded by the friends we'd made in this new life. By then, I'd co-founded my own investment firm with 2 partners I trusted implicitly. We specialized in identifying undervalued companies in emerging markets, and our track record was becoming impossible to ignore. Money started flowing in from investors who wanted in on our success. 5 years after I'd left home, I received an unexpected invitation. A major business magazine was hosting a gala in my home city to celebrate the top entrepreneurs and business leaders of the year. My firm had made the list, and they wanted me to be the keynote speaker. The irony wasn't lost on me. returning to the place that had broken me, but this time on my own terms. I discussed it with my wife, and she immediately said we should go. She was curious to see where I'd come from, and she thought it might bring me closure. I wasn't sure about closure, but I was sure about one thing. I was no longer the man who'd walked out of that coffee shop 5 years ago. The gala was held at the city's most exclusive hotel, a place I'd once walked past and never imagined entering. Now I was entering as the guest of honor. My wife looked stunning in an emerald dress that had been custom-made by a designer who owed her firm a favor. I wore a tailored suit that cost more than my entire wardrobe had 5 years ago, though I'd learned that real wealth whispers. We arrived fashionably late, as my wife had insisted. The ballroom was already filled with the city's elite, business owners, politicians, old money families, and social climbers. I scanned the room casually and felt my chest tighten when I spotted them near the bar. My ex-fiancée stood next to my cousin, and even from across the room, I could see the cracks in the facade. She wore an expensive dress, but it hung on her frame like she'd lost weight. My cousin had the same cocky smile I remembered, though his hairline had receded and there was a tightness around his eyes. My mother stood with them, holding court as she always had, gesturing animatedly as she spoke to another couple. My wife noticed my expression and squeezed my hand, asking quietly if I was all right. I told her they were here, the people from my past. She looked in their direction, studied them for a moment, then turned back to me with a small smile. She told me to hold my head high because I'd earned everything I had, and no one could take that from me. The magazine's editor found us and led us toward the stage area, explaining the evening's program. As we walked through the crowd, I noticed heads turning, whispers starting. Some people recognized me from the business features that had been published about my firm. Others were clearly trying to figure out who the distinguished-looking couple was. We passed within 15 feet of my family's group, and I saw the exact moment my mother recognized me. Her face went through a rapid sequence of expressions: shock, disbelief, confusion, and something that might have been fear. She grabbed my cousin's arm and whispered something urgent. He turned, and our eyes met for the first time in 5 years. I nodded politely, the way you might acknowledge a stranger, and kept walking. My wife, perceptive as always, gave them a gracious smile that revealed nothing. The dinner portion of the evening was excruciating for them, I later learned. They'd been seated in the general audience section while my wife and I sat at the head table with the other honorees. I could feel my mother's eyes on me throughout the meal, and I knew exactly what she was thinking. How had her disappointing son ended up at the most important table in the room? When it came time for my keynote speech, I walked to the podium and looked out at the sea of faces. I'd prepared remarks about entrepreneurship and risk-taking, but standing there, I decided to speak from the heart instead. I talked about failure and rejection, about how the greatest business lessons often come from our lowest moments. I spoke about the importance of betting on yourself when no one else will, about building something meaningful rather than inheriting something you didn't earn. I never mentioned names or specific situations, but anyone who knew my story would understand the subtext. I talked about my wife, about how I'd met someone who valued ambition and partnership equally, who'd built her own success and understood that real wealth was created through innovation and hard work. I gestured to where she sat, and the cameras focused on her as she smiled warmly. The applause was thunderous. As I returned to my seat, I glanced toward where my family sat and saw my ex-fiancée's face had gone pale. My cousin was staring down at his plate. My mother looked like she'd aged 10 years in the past hour. After the speeches, the networking portion began. I was immediately surrounded by people wanting to discuss investments, partnerships, and opportunities. My wife handled the conversations with the same grace she brought to everything, occasionally touching my arm or adding insights that impressed everyone she spoke with. That's when my mother made her move. She approached through the crowd, my father trailing behind her looking uncomfortable. She'd clearly been crying at some point. Her makeup was slightly smudged. She positioned herself in my line of sight and waited for a break in the conversation. When the moment came, she stepped forward and said my name like a question. I turned to her with the polite but distant expression I'd perfected in business negotiations. I acknowledged her formally, introducing her to the group I'd been speaking with as someone I'd known years ago. The casual dismissal in my tone was deliberate. She was no longer my mother in any meaningful sense, just another person from my past. She tried to pull me aside, saying we needed to talk, that she'd made mistakes, that she never imagined things would turn out this way. I told her very calmly that there was nothing to discuss, that I'd moved on completely, and that I hoped she was well. The finality in my voice made her flinch. My father stepped forward then and tried a different approach. He congratulated me on my success, said he'd always known I had potential, that he'd tried to reach out over the years, but I'd changed my number. I corrected him gently, reminding him that he'd never tried very hard, that when I'd needed my family most, they'd chosen my cousin's money over me. My wife appeared at my elbow with perfect timing, smoothly suggesting we should greet some of the other guests. She linked her arm through mine, gave my parents a polite nod, and guided me away before the situation could escalate. But my cousin and ex-fiancée weren't done. They intercepted us near the dessert table, and I could see desperation in both their faces. My cousin tried the jovial approach, acting like we were old friends catching up. He congratulated me on my success, made a joke about how the quiet ones always surprise you, then casually mentioned that his real estate business had been facing some challenges lately and perhaps we could discuss some investment opportunities. The audacity was breathtaking. I looked at him for a long moment, then told him very clearly that my firm only invested in companies with solid fundamentals and ethical leadership, so unfortunately, I couldn't help him. My ex-fiancée had been silent during this exchange, but now she spoke up. She told me I looked well, that success suited me, and that she sometimes thought about how things might have been different. There was a pleading quality to her voice that I recognized. She was testing the waters, seeing if there was any remaining affection she could exploit. I introduced her to my wife, watching as the two women sized each other up. My wife extended her hand graciously and mentioned that I'd told her all about my past. The emphasis on all was subtle but unmistakable. My ex-fiancée's smile faltered. My wife then mentioned, almost casually, that we should really mingle more as there were several potential clients she wanted me to meet. She'd positioned herself as my equal partner, someone who understood business and contributed to my success, and the contrast with my ex-fiancée couldn't have been clearer. As we walked away, my ex-fiancée called after me, asking if we could talk privately. I turned back and told her there was nothing left to say, that she'd made her choice 5 years ago, and I'd made mine. I wished her well and meant it, not because I'd forgiven her, but because she was so completely irrelevant to my life now that forgiveness felt unnecessary. The rest of the evening passed in a blur of congratulations and business cards. My wife charmed everyone she met, and I watched with pride as she discussed her firm's latest projects with the same passion I brought to my work. We were a team, partners in every sense of the word, and everyone could see it. As the gala wound down, the magazine editor pulled me aside and mentioned that my speech had been the highlight of the evening. He said several people had asked about my background, intrigued by the hints I'd dropped about overcoming adversity. He wanted to do a full profile piece on my journey from analyst to firm co-founder. I agreed, knowing that the story would eventually reach everyone in my old circle. Let them read about how I'd built something real from nothing, how I'd found success and happiness without them. My wife and I left the hotel well past midnight. As we waited for our car, I looked back at the glittering building and felt something unexpected, not satisfaction or vindication, but simple peace. I'd spent 5 years running from the pain they'd caused, transforming it into fuel for success. But standing there with my wife's hand in mine, I realized I'd stopped running somewhere along the way. The revenge I'd imagined in those early, bitter days had never materialized because it had never been necessary. They'd destroyed themselves through their own choices. My cousin's business struggles weren't my doing. They were the result of inherited wealth meeting actual market challenges. My ex-fiancée's hollow life wasn't my revenge. It was the natural consequence of choosing money over genuine connection. My mother's regret wasn't something I'd engineered. It was simply the price of her own manipulations coming home to roost. My wife asked me what I was thinking, and I told her the truth. I was thinking about how grateful I was for that awful night 5 years ago because without it, I never would have left. I never would have pushed myself to grow. I never would have met her. She smiled and said that everything happens for a reason, though she was glad my reasons led me to her. As our car arrived and we drove away from the gala, from the city of my past, from the people who'd broken me once upon a time, I felt the final piece of that old pain dissolve. I'd won, but not in the way I'd once imagined. The real victory wasn't in their shocked faces or their obvious regrets. It was in the life I'd built, the woman beside me, and the absolute certainty that I'd never needed their approval in the first place. Update 1. 3 days after the gala, my phone started receiving messages. First from extended family members I hadn't heard from in years, suddenly interested in reconnecting. Then from old acquaintances who'd seen the magazine photos and wanted to catch up. I ignored most of them, but one message stood out, from my father, sent at 2 in the morning. He asked if we could meet for coffee, just the two of us. He said he had things he needed to say that he couldn't say in front of my mother. Against my better judgment, I agreed, though I chose the location, a cafe near my hotel, neutral territory. He looked older than he had at the gala, more worn down. He ordered coffee he didn't drink and spent the first 5 minutes apologizing for everything. He explained that he'd never agreed with my mother's interference, that he'd argued against it, but he'd been weak and let her convince him that she knew best. He said watching me at the gala had made him realize what he'd lost. I listened without interrupting, and when he finished, I told him the truth. His apology came 5 years too late, offered only after he'd seen my success. If I'd remained the struggling analyst, would he be sitting here now? He couldn't answer that. He asked if there was any way to rebuild what we'd lost. I told him honestly that I didn't know, that trust once broken was nearly impossible to fully repair, but that I was willing to start with occasional emails and see where things went. No promises, no expectations, just careful steps forward. He accepted that with visible relief, and we parted with a handshake rather than a hug. It was a start, however fragile. I never heard from my mother directly. According to my father's later emails, she was devastated by how things had unfolded, but too proud to reach out herself. Apparently, the social fallout from the gala had been significant. People in their circle had been gossiping about how she'd pushed away her successful son in favor of the cousin whose business was now circling the drain. My cousin's company ended up filing for bankruptcy protection 6 months later. Overextension, poor management, and a changing real estate market had combined to destroy what his father had built. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. As for my ex-fiancée, I heard through the family grapevine that she and my cousin separated. Whether the divorce was finalized, I neither knew nor cared. My wife and I returned to Singapore, to our life, to our work. We'd occasionally discuss that night at the gala, and she'd always say the same thing, that the best revenge was living well, and we were living very well indeed. She was right. Every morning I woke up next to her. Every deal my firm closed. Every achievement we celebrated together was proof that sometimes the worst betrayals lead to the best transformations. They'd thought they were choosing the better life, the easier path, the safer bet. They'd chosen wrong, and I'd chosen freedom. That was all the revenge I'd ever need. If you like this story, please like this video and subscribe us for more such real-life-based stories. Thanks in advance.